Azkaban is the prison that even the most notorious wizards would hesitate visiting. It's always been advertised as this frightening, unbreakable site that reeks of misery and pain, and frankly, that's not an exaggeration. People who have spent even a day in Azkaban speak of it with the most primal terror in their hearts and their eyes. So, what secrets lurk within the four walls of this eerie prison sitting on top of a lonely island? Turns out, there's more to Azkaban than any of us have ever known about, both in the wizarding world and in our Muggle one. It stands as a testament to how bleak the lines between punishment and cruelty are. That's how sinister its history is. Its legacy is one of terror and will forever be etched into the darkest corners of the wizarding world. And let me tell you, that's a feat in itself, considering we're talking about the Harry Potter universe here. The sinister history of Azkaban is shrouded in mystery and deceit. Its true origins remain known to only a few, but in this video, we're going to tear through the shadows to break it all down, or at least we'll try to the best of our capabilities. But before we get on with it, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments about what you'd like for us to cover next. Let's get started. Believe it or not, Azkaban wasn't always a prison, but the one thing that never changed was that it always had a dark past. Before Azkaban became the infamous prison we know today, the island it sits on was shrouded in mystery. It never appeared on any map and was hidden from both Muggles and wizards. It was kept under powerful concealment charms by the dark wizard Ikrisdis, who we discussed in detail in our Dementors breakdown video. While it's unclear if Ikrisdis was responsible for creating the prison, the one thing that we do know is that he was the first resident of the island. He constructed a fortress on the island and practiced the worst kinds of dark magic right there. It is believed that he would lure Muggle sailors to the fortress, sometimes going to the lengths of kidnapping them, and then expose them to the worst forms of torture. Some people even claim that he even used the Muggles as lab rats for his dark experiments. When Ikrisdis passed away, the concealment charms hiding the island started fading, and his crimes were finally exposed to the world. Naturally, when the Ministry of Magic saw this mysterious island pop up on the map out of nowhere, they sent a team to go down there and investigate. The disturbing thing is that whatever the appointed team found there was so creepy that they refused to talk about it. Unfortunately, it all remained a secret to this day. The only thing ever acknowledged was the presence of Dementors. Some believe they were the result of Ikrisdis' twisted lab experiments on Muggles. Despite the island's dark history, they were the prime reason the Ministry couldn't simply destroy Azkaban, so the island remained abandoned for years after its discovery. That is, until the Ministry began entertaining a chilling idea. The idea to turn the place into a prison for the scum of the wizarding world. There was a lot of friction in the Ministry over the topic of Azkaban during the 15th century. While some people were rooting for the island to become the new wizarding prison, others were against the idea. The people in favor of the prison claimed that they needed better precautionary measures to guard the wizarding world's privacy. They believed that as time went by, there would be more dark wizards like Ikrisdis who wouldn't hesitate 1 minute while flexing their sinister crimes. If you think about it, the island was the perfect fit for a wizarding prison. It was a remote location, away from prying eyes, and was perfect for hosting the most notorious criminals. The best part was almost no one knew that it existed in the first place. The only problem the Ministry was facing was the Dementors. Considering how enigmatic and downright evil these creatures were, they did not have it in them to banish them from the island. The Ministry feared that these magical creatures would escape and would latch onto anyone as vengeance for depriving them of a home. That fear was so evident within the Ministry that they were willing to put prisoners through this miserable ordeal rather than risk the idea of Dementors roaming free. They believed that they couldn't afford to build smaller prisons around the region. It would bring unnecessary attention to the wizarding world and also put the Ministry under immense pressure for securing them. So they proposed the idea of throwing all the prisoners into one giant building. The fortress that was so graciously given to them by the likes of Ikrisdis and was already on the island. As for the Dementors, they could take on the role of prison guards. According to them, it was the perfect idea. The Dementors won't have to leave the island in search of food, and the prisoners would be too miserable to leave. But understandably, there were people in the ministry who opposed this idea. They believed doing this would be too ruthless and inhumane for the prisoners, regardless of their crime. Unfortunately, the argument couldn't win the authorities over, and the ministry was forced to transform the lone fortress on the island into Azkaban in 1718. Once the prison was built, one minister of magic, Eldritch Diggory, decided to visit Azkaban. He was mortified by what he had witnessed there, to say the least. He didn't expect to see such awful conditions inside the prison. According to his claims, most prisoners inside the fortress had died out of despair, while others were on the verge of going insane. Driven by empathy, he returned to London and established a committee to come up with alternatives for Azkaban. Unfortunately, he died before the committee could reach any decision. Ultimately, the idea of finding alternatives started fading away, and the horrors of Azkaban were eventually sidelined until they were completely forgotten. Azkaban hosted thousands of criminals under the miserable authority of the Dementors for centuries. The ministers that came after Diggory even found ways to renovate the prison. They were never motivated to build another one and seemed quite satisfied with Azkaban. Over the years, its reputation started becoming more and more sinister, and naturally, it was ultimately labeled as the worst prison in the world. But beyond its horrors, there was one thing about Azkaban that became undeniable. It wasn't just a place of no return, it was a fortress from which escape seemed utterly impossible. Was the ministry justified in using Azkaban as a prison, knowing it meant subjecting inmates to treatment that was far worse than death itself? Or did they simply take the easy way out and were prepared to ignore the moral implication behind such horrendous innovation? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and if this got you thinking, don't forget to subscribe. Azkaban had a fearsome reputation. For centuries, no one dared to escape the four walls of the prison. The very thought of fleeing the misery of the prison never even crossed the minds of the prisoners. Two people had the guts to defy all odds, but they were mere exceptions. In the Goblet of Fire, it was revealed that Barty Crouch Jr. had crafted a cunning plan to escape prison using Polyjuice Potion. When his dying mother came to visit him in Azkaban with his father, he switched places with her. Then he walked right out of the prison, which was all for naught, considering how not a year afterwards he was arrested once again. The Dementors could only detect the presence of a living soul. They were sorely unable to distinguish between the sick and the healthy. This loophole made Crouch's plan a dangerously clever means of escape. Then there was Sirius Black. He was the only other wizard to have tricked the Dementors and walked out of the prison alive. Since he was an unregistered animagus, he turned into a dog and slipped right past them. It's not that the Dementors were blind to animals, it's the fact that their perception of them was limited. An animal's mind lacks the depth and complexity of a human's, which made it far easier for Sirius to slip through unnoticed. But here's the thing. Sirius spent years in Azkaban without even considering to escape. It wasn't until he spotted Scabbers in the Daily Prophet that he had the motivation to leave. He was one of the few people who knew that Scabbers was actually another unregistered animagus, Peter Pettigrew. With how much he was angry at the past, he knew he had to get out of Azkaban and get his revenge. So the reputation of Azkaban being unbreakable is not entirely false. But it's not really true either. The Dementors were intelligent and ruthless creatures. They were always on the watch and would ensure that no prisoner could simply walk past them. But they weren't as smart as you might think. Both Sirius and Barty Crouch Jr. proved that. But again, Azkaban wasn't any ordinary prison. It was designed to break the prisoners mentally and force them to regret their actions and drool in a pool of misery. There were no cells, no iron bars, simply because they were not needed. Technically, the prisoners were allowed to go free, yet they never dared to escape. Most inmates would lose their minds within weeks. With the Dementors on their back constantly, they were completely unable to hold on to any sense of self. The few who managed to survive weren't even truly alive. They were hollow and emotionless, and were simply trapped in an infinite nightmare. Azkaban literally existed to erase the idea of hope itself, and most of us probably know from experience that it's only hope that drives the world forward. Things changed for the worse during the Second Wizarding World. That was the first time Azkaban saw massive breakouts. However, it wasn't because of the prisoners hatching up on secret plans or them trying to fool the Dementors. It was mainly because the Dementors had decided to join Voldemort's army. That's when a lot of Death Eaters were allowed to leave the prison. It was a pretty difficult time for the Wizarding World, though. Instead of being used as a prison for the evil wizards, Azkaban was now there to host enemies of Voldemort. It's so tragic how most of them died or went mad without even knowing why they were in Azkaban in the first place. While Azkaban was once the most feared prison in the world, things have changed in modern times. After the fall of Voldemort, the Ministry of Magic underwent a major reform. The biggest change came when Kingsley fired the Dementors from their roles of Azkaban's prison guards. The magical creatures that were once responsible for the extreme mental torture of prisoners were finally considered too dangerous for the prisoners. In their place, human Aurors were put in charge of the security. A way more humane and normal way to treat bad guys, in my opinion. Despite these big changes, Azkaban still remains the prison of nightmares, considering how it's still a place meant for the worst criminals. While it no longer thrives on breaking people from the inside out, it is still nearly impossible to flee the walls of Azkaban, not to mention that the name Azkaban is still enough to send shivers down the spines of witches and wizards. That's a wrap on Azkaban and its reign as the most ruthless prison in wizarding history. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and ring that bell icon to keep the magic alive, and I'll catch you next time.